The first crack of dawn was a lie. Inside the thick concrete walls of Battery W62, Hauptmann Klaus Richter felt the vibrations in the sand beneath his boots before he heard anything. A distant, almost imperceptible hum that would soon become a roar. The North Sea stretched grey and merciless, fog rolling across its surface as though trying to hide an unspeakable horror. Richter's eyes flicked to the horizon, scanning the waters for any sign of the approaching enemy. The tides shifted slowly, deceptively, masking the scale of the coming storm. Somewhere in that mist, thousands of men were moving, and he knew somehow that their movement would shatter everything he knew about this world. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and gun oil. Soldiers moved quietly but briskly, hauling ammunition, checking weaponry, repeating drills they had performed dozens of times. Yet, despite all their preparation, an undercurrent of tension pulsed through every man. Richter could feel it in the way Private Schmitz's hands trembled as he loaded shells, in the rigid posture of Obergefreiter Müller, in the sharp intake of breath from Corporal Meyer. They were all waiting for the storm to break, and Richter, standing taller than most, understood the truth they all tried to deny. Nothing in their training could prepare them for the enormity of what was coming. A sudden flare of light broke the horizon. Richter froze. For an instant, the world slowed, the wind, the waves, the shuffling feet inside the bunker, all suspended in that split second. He could see a small craft, barely a speck, skimming across the water, its shape uncertain through the haze, too distant to matter. Perhaps. Yet something deep in Richter's chest told him otherwise. This was the first whisper of a tempest that would drown them all. He took a deep breath and barked orders, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Positions. Load. Target coordinate. His men reacted with mechanical precision, their fear harnessed into trained obedience. The guns, mostly 88mm artillery pieces, were loaded, sighted, and ready. Richter moved between them, adjusting angles, calculating distances, checking lines of fire. Every movement was precise, deliberate, a dance of life and death in slow motion. And all the while that hum on the horizon grew louder, vibrating through the sand, through the walls, through Richter's chest. From his observation slit, he could see the ocean itself change. The fog lifted in patches, revealing tiny dots moving closer, hundreds, then thousands. Landing craft, soldiers hunched in the shallow water, weapons held above their heads. Ships on the horizon. The first shell hit, throwing water high into the air, followed by another. The world erupted into chaos in an instant. Richter ducked instinctively, his ears ringing from the blast. Shrapnel pinged off the concrete walls, spattering dust and grit into his eyes. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" he shouted. The guns roared in response, deafening, violent, unforgiving. He saw the first landing craft capsize, men flailing in the water, some disappearing beneath the surf. And still, the tide of humanity pressed forward. The noise was unbearable, the thunder of artillery, the shriek of falling shells, the crack of rifles, the panicked screams. Richter felt a nausea rise in his stomach as he tried to catalogue the scene, trying to make sense of it. This was not war as they had trained for it, was something larger, unstoppable, apocalyptic. Amid the chaos, Richter's thoughts flickered to his family. Letters he would never write, voices he would never hear, life beyond the bunker walls. He knew these thoughts were dangerous. Distraction could mean death for him, for his men. He shook them off and focused on survival, on duty. Every order he issued carried the weight of life and death. Target the right flank. Adjust. Fire again. His voice was a lifeline amid the storm. He noticed Private Schmidt, faltering, his hands trembling as he tried to reload. Richter grabbed him, gripping his shoulders firmly. "Do it, or we all die." The young soldier nodded, swallowed his fear, and continued. Around him, other men were performing acts of mechanical heroism, moving shells, cranking guns, sighting targets, all while explosions threw sand, water, and bodies into the air. Every second was an eternity. Every decision was amplified 100-fold by the stakes of survival. By 5, the beach was a furnace of fire and water. Smoke coiled into the sky like dark serpents, obscuring the sun. The first waves of Allied troops had landed. Richter could see them moving through the surf, crawling under fire, scrambling up the dunes. Some fell instantly, some pressed forward, unflinching. The determination on their faces was unmistakable. He felt a chill. The men he had trained to defend the coast would not stop this tide alone. Yet he had to try. Inside the bunker, Richter barked more orders, repositioning gunners, calculating new firing arcs, counting shells, rationing ammunition. The minutes stretched into hours, each one a battle in miniature. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Richter felt a pressure in his chest, a tightness that threatened to suffocate him. Fear and adrenaline fused into something raw and primal, sharpening his senses, focusing his mind. Survival depended on clarity, and clarity demanded suppression of everything else. Doubt, grief, even pity. Outside, the hum of planes joined the cacophony of artillery. Shadows flickered across the bunker walls as dive bombers roared overhead, strafing the dunes, dropping fire, shaking the earth. Richter ducked again, counting seconds, mapping trajectories, adjusting. The world had narrowed to the space inside this bunker, and the small patch of beach beyond its observation slit. It was a crucible, a test of every skill, every decision he had ever learned. Failure meant death, not just his own, but his men's. And yet, amidst the horror, Richter felt a strange clarity. The storm had begun. The tide had turned. And inside this concrete coffin, he alone stood between order and chaos. The first real wave of D-Day had struck, and Klaus Richter, Hauptmann of Battery WN62, would meet it head-on. The morning fog had thickened, turning the coastline into a smoldering haze. Each wave that crashed against the beach seemed to carry with it another nightmare, and the roar of artillery punctuated the cries of men struggling in the surf. Hauptmann Klaus Richter. S Battery had opened fire with everything they possessed: 88mm guns, 75mm artillery, and the relentless staccato of machine guns, but the tide of the enemy seemed endless. Landing craft approached like black insects crawling over the misty water, each one disgorging soldiers who, despite the chaos, moved with terrifying precision. Inside the bunker, Richter moved between stations, shouting commands and taking stock of his men as positions. Private Schmitz, still pale from the morning terror, worked the machine gun with trembling hands. Richter clenched his jaw and grabbed the young soldier's shoulder. "Focus. Your life depends on it." He barked, his voice cutting through the smoke. Schmitz nodded, swallowing hard, and aimed at the advancing troops. Richter's eyes flicked to Corporal Meyer, who had loaded the 75mm with meticulous urgency, sweat dripping from his brow. Every man inside the bunker was a mixture of fear, determination, and exhaustion, a fragile lattice of human will holding back the chaos beyond the walls. The first shells from the Allies slammed into the dunes near the bunker, sending plumes of sand and fire into the sky. Richter ducked instinctively as a piece of shrapnel ricocheted off the steel-reinforced wall, embedding itself with a screech. The vibrations reverberated through the floor and into his bones. "Adjust. Elevation 3 degrees right, 1 click." He yelled, adrenaline sharpening every movement. Outside, the beach became a theater of violence. Water turned crimson, smoke blurred the horizon, and men screamed as they fell, rose, and pressed forward again. A tank rolled into view, its treads grinding sand and rock, oblivious to the hell surrounding it. Richter's 80mm guns tracked its slow but inexorable approach. "Fire!" he commanded. The bunker trembled with the recoil, a deafening boom followed by a plume of smoke and debris. The tank shuddered, rocked, and then toppled, caught by the precise shelling. Richter allowed himself a brief, fleeting satisfaction. One more moment of control in a day governed by chaos. Yet for every success, the Allies pressed harder. Waves of infantry clambered from the wreckage of landing craft, crawling through sand and surf, determined to reach the top of the bluffs. Smoke from destroyed vehicles and burning fuel filled the air, making it difficult to see, to breathe, to even think. Richter realized that no human effort, no matter how disciplined, could hold them back indefinitely. And still they fought desperation, giving birth to coordination and courage in equal measure. From the observation slit, Richter spotted the first breach in the beach defenses. A squad had broken through, advancing past the barbed wire and mines laid days earlier. He barked orders, directing machine guns and mortars toward the gap. Cover the east, fire at will. His men responded, moving like parts of a single organism, every action calculated, precise. The cacophony outside was almost unimaginable. The roar of guns, the whistle of shells, the pounding surf, the shouts and screams, an unrelenting symphony of destruction. Suddenly, a nearby mortar slammed into a secondary bunker, collapsing part of the wall. 3 of Richter's men were killed instantly, their bodies thrown across the room. Dust and smoke filled the air, choking and suffocating. Richter staggered to the wall, coughing, trying to regain composure. He felt a wave of nausea, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The young recruits, some barely more than boys, stared wide-eyed at the devastation, frozen between terror and duty. Richter had no time for grief. He had to act. Every second wasted meant more deaths, more loss of ground, more momentum for the enemy. He issued rapid orders, repositioning the remaining guns, redirecting fire, and coordinating with flak units overhead. Each decision was immediate, precise, and brutal in its necessity. There was no time for hesitation. Every man who moved, fired, or took cover was caught in a delicate ballet orchestrated by Richter's mind, every movement weighted with consequence. By mid-morning, the realization sank in: the Allies were not merely attacking, they were overwhelming. Richter's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and admiration. The invaders were coordinated, relentless, and terrifyingly efficient. Each landing craft that reached the sand delivered not only men but a psychological blow, a reminder that no fortress, no gun nest, no human courage could fully resist the scale of the assault. Yet Richter's men held their ground, their discipline a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Amid the gunfire and smoke, Richter saw moments of humanity. Corporal Meyer, covered in soot and sweat, dragged a wounded comrade behind a sandbag wall, ignoring the hail of bullets overhead. Private Weber, trembling violently, managed to load a machine gun after Richter. Firm intervention. The acts were fleeting, almost invisible in the scale of the battle, yet they carried immense significance. Courage, Richter realized, was not in the grand gestures but in surviving, in persisting, in executing one's duty despite fear. The horizon trembled with more shells, more smoke, more chaos. Planes droned overhead, dive bombers strafing positions, their silhouettes black against the smoky sky. The tide of fire and metal was relentless. Richter's bunker shook, dust falling from the ceiling, walls vibrating with each impact. He felt the enormity of the moment, the singularity of his duty. Every command mattered, every hesitation could be fatal, and yet, amidst the roar, he found clarity. Focus was survival, discipline was salvation. By late morning, the first wave of Allies had secured sections of the beach. Richter's eyes narrowed, scanning, calculating. They had paid a terrible price, yet they persisted, moving through death and fire toward the dunes. He barked orders again, adjusting gun angles, rationing remaining shells, moving his men from position to position. The sounds of battle became an almost tangible presence, a living entity that Richter had to anticipate, direct, and survive. And so, inside the smoke-filled bunker, Hauptmann Klaus Richter pressed on. The day had begun with a lie, the first crack of dawn, but now it was a reality forged in fire, smoke, and blood. The beach beyond was a living nightmare, yet within these concrete walls he clung to control, discipline, and the fragile hope that his men would endure, if only for another hour, another minute. For in this crucible of D-Day, every moment survived was both a victory and a reminder of the terrible cost of war. By late morning, the battle for Normandy had taken on a surreal, almost nightmarish quality. Hauptmann Klaus Richter stood in the center of his command bunker, eyes scanning maps smeared with chalk and ink, listening to the staccato bursts of gunfire and the distant rumble of naval artillery. Communications with higher command were fragmentary at best. Reports came in broken fragments over the radio, tinged with panic, confusion, and contradictory intelligence. Reinforcements were delayed, diverted, or, in some cases, non-existent. The Luftwaffe was absent in any meaningful way, its planes grounded or scattered by Allied air superiority. Richter felt a profound isolation settle over him. For the first time in his military career, he understood the stark truth: his men, his guns, and he alone were facing the onslaught. Through the narrow slit of the observation post, Richter saw the beach below transform into a living horror. Smoke and fire blurred the horizon, twisted metal jutted from sand, and men moved like ants among the devastation. Bodies of both German and Allied soldiers lay sprawled in the surf, twisted and indistinguishable at this distance. Landing craft overturned, throwing soldiers into the icy water where waves threatened to pull them under. Yet the invaders pressed on, unflinching, crawling toward the bluffs with determination that no artillery barrage could fully deter. Richter barked orders, coordinating movements between his artillery pieces, machine gun nests, and mortar positions. Shift fire to grid Sen. Cover the eastern approach. Prepare the flak. Fire. Each command was executed instantly. Men responding with mechanical precision honed through months of discipline and fear. And yet, with each successful strike, a part of Richter's heart sank. Every bullet fired, every shell launched, every tactical maneuver was only a temporary reprieve against an unstoppable force. He began to feel the weight of futility pressing down on him, an oppressive knowledge that no matter how effective their resistance, the tide could not be fully stopped. The men under his command were visibly fraying at the edges. Private Schmitz, barely 19, had lost all color in his face, his hands shaking as he attempted to reload. Richter gripped his shoulder and pulled him aside. "Steady. Look at the target, not the chaos," he commanded, forcing the boy to focus. The young soldier nodded, swallowed, and returned to his post with renewed, if fragile, determination. Richter moved on to Obergefreiter Müller, who was slumped against the wall, jaw tight, eyes flicking nervously to the observation slit. "Müller, cover the machine gun, and remember your life depends on your discipline." The man nodded, pulling himself upright. Amid the cacophony, Richter noticed the first real breach of German defenses. A small group of Allied soldiers had exploited a gap between sandbag emplacements, crawling under machine gun fire, moving closer to the dunes with terrifying efficiency. Richter's mind raced as he calculated trajectories, firing arcs, and probabilities. Every second was a battle against time, every decision a negotiation with death itself. He barked orders for all available guns to focus fire, coordinating the remaining mortars and directing flak units overhead. Each command carried the weight of dozens of lives, yet he issued them with a practiced calm, masking the storm roiling inside him. The psychological strain on the men was impossible to ignore. Fear manifested in silence, panic, and trembling hands. Some of the young recruits had never faced such terror, had never seen death move so deliberately and closely. Richter forced himself to acknowledge it, to integrate it into his command strategy. The fear, he realized, could be harnessed, directed into precision, into discipline, into survival. "Do your duty," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Every second you hesitate, lives are lost." Despite the carnage, there were moments of quiet heroism, fleeting glimpses of human resilience amid horror. Corporal Meyer had dragged a wounded comrade to cover under machine gun fire, ignoring the personal danger. Private Weber, trembling violently, managed to reload a weapon with Richter's firm guidance. These acts were brief, almost imperceptible in the larger scope of battle, yet they mattered. They reminded Richter, and perhaps the men themselves, that courage was not grandiose. Courage was a moment, a choice, a single act of survival against overwhelming odds. The beach itself was a living entity, reacting to each salvo, each maneuver, each misstep. Waves of Allied troops pressed forward, regrouping after shelling, advancing under smoke and fire. Tanks struggled over sand and obstacles, their movement labored, methodical, yet unstoppable in numbers. Every successful German hit was countered by fresh forces. Every gap closed seemed temporary, every advantage fleeting. Richter felt a cold clarity settle in his mind. The battle was no longer about victory. It was about delaying the inevitable, about making every second count, about exacting the maximum toll on the invaders before collapse. Richter moved back to the observation slit, binoculars pressed to his eyes. A reconnaissance plane droned overhead, its silhouette barely visible through the smoke. He calculated angles for anti-aircraft fire, aware that the plane was scouting for artillery position. "Target it if it comes within range," he instructed, yet a deep unease gnawed at him. Every calculation, every action, was a delicate balance between control and chaos. Even the most disciplined gun crews could be undone by a single misstep, a stray shell, a soldier faltering. The radio crackled with more fragmented updates, officers shouting about breaches, supply shortages, and the relentless advance of the Allies. Richter barely registered the words, focusing instead on his immediate sphere of influence, the men in his bunker, the guns in their positions, the stretch of beach visible through the smoke. He knew that no command from above could alter the course of events quickly enough to prevent disaster. Responsibility had compressed into an all-consuming weight, pressing down on his shoulders, embedding itself in his every thought. And yet, amidst the confusion, a strange rhythm emerged. The soldiers moved as a single organism, responding to Richter's commands, adapting to the chaos. Fear, training, and instinct interwove to create fleeting order in a world governed by violence. Richter allowed himself the briefest acknowledgement. Survival in this moment depended on focus, on discipline, on unity. Every second that passed without catastrophe was a victory in its own right. By midday, the battle raged in a relentless, brutal crescendo. The horizon blurred with smoke and fire, the beach churned with struggling men, the bunker trembled with every incoming shell. Richter's thoughts flickered between strategy and the human cost, between calculations and fleeting compassion, between duty and fear. He understood one immutable truth: in war, clarity was power, fear was fuel, and every decision carried the weight of life and death. And in this crucible, Hauptmann Klaus Richter would continue to command, to calculate, to survive no matter the cost. Afternoon descended over Normandy like a suffocating shroud, turning smoke and sand into a grey, choking haze. The roar of guns, the hiss of bullets, and the relentless pounding of naval artillery had become a constant, almost living presence inside Battery WN62. Hauptmann Klaus Richter moved through the bunker with purposeful precision, shouting orders, checking guns, and guiding his men through a storm that had no clear beginning and no foreseeable end. Each man inside was stretched to the brink, yet somehow still functioning. Fear molded into grim determination, terror sharpened into a razor-edged focus. Through the narrow observation slit, Richter surveyed the battlefield. Smoke rose from craters, landing craft floundered in the surf, and the relentless tide of Allied troops pressed forward, relentless and coordinated. He barked instructions to his gunners, redirecting fire toward the most immediate threats, calculating trajectories, adjusting for wind and tide. Every second mattered. Every shell fired could mean life or death. Yet, despite his calculated precision, the numbers told a grim story. The Allies had begun to breach the eastern defenses, and reinforcements were nowhere in sight. The sense of isolation pressed on him, heavy as concrete, nearly as oppressive as the bunker walls surrounding him. Amid the chaos, Richter noticed flashes of heroism. Corporal Meyer had climbed atop a disabled gun under enemy fire manually, loading it for one more desperate salvo. Private Weber, still trembling, had finally found his rhythm, his hands moving, with the deadly precision of someone who had been forged in terror. Richter allowed himself a fleeting, grim admiration. It was these small acts, the individual courage, amid overwhelming odds, that defined survival in a day drenched in blood and smoke. The ground trembled as another shell slammed into the sand outside, throwing water and debris high into the air. Richter ducked instinctively, the vibration rattling through the walls and into his bones. He barked more orders, coordinating machine guns, mortars, and flak units to cover the breaches. Hold your ground. Fire at the eastern flank. Don't let them through. His voice was raw, unyielding but precise. Every command was a thread in the fragile web holding back annihilation. The battle raged on, a terrifying tide that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Allied soldiers scrambled over sandbags, swam through freezing surf, and charged up the dunes with a relentless determination that defied human logic. Each act of bravery, each misstep, each scream echoed in Richter's mind, amplifying the stakes of every decision he made. The world outside had become a furnace of fire, smoke, and chaos, and inside the bunker, every heartbeat was a test of endurance. Then, for a moment, the day paused, not because the battle stopped, but because Richter's mind caught a sliver of clarity. He realized how precarious their situation had become. Supplies were dwindling, men were exhausted, and the enemy showed no sign of faltering. Every gunshot, every shell, every order delayed the inevitable, but it could not prevent it. Richter took a breath, forcing his body and mind to steel themselves for the next wave. The tide was turning, and the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. By the way, if you're clinging to this moment with me, make sure to hit subscribe. More awaits just ahead. His voice echoed faintly in the bunker as he returned to the reality of command. He had no time for pause. The eastern breaches required immediate action. Richter repositioned his artillery crews, allocating raining shells to cover the most vulnerable approaches. Mortars roared, machine guns rattled, and the bunker itself vibrated with the ferocity of battle. Every decision was an attempt to balance the relentless progression of the Allies with the stubborn will of the defenders. Through the observation slit, he saw the human cost with brutal clarity. Soldiers, German and Allied alike, fell in the sand, in the surf, in the smoke, and then others took their place. The beach was no longer a line or a position. It was a living, breathing entity, pulsating with violence. Every step, every movement mattered. Every moment of hesitation could tip the balance. Richter felt the enormity of responsibility crushing him, yet he forced his fear into obedience, directing fire with ruthless efficiency. As the afternoon wore on, he observed another horror. A small squad of Allied soldiers had managed to advance through a gap between sandbag positions, moving toward the dunes with terrifying speed. Richter barked orders to his remaining machine gunners and mortars, coordinating their fire with a precision born of desperation. Smoke obscured the enemy's movements, yet Richter calculated angles, distances, and probabilities with the cold logic of a man who had made peace with chaos. Amid the destruction, Richter found brief moments of human resilience. Corporal Meyer dragged a wounded comrade behind the cover of a crumbling wall. Private Weber continued firing despite exhaustion, and others reinforced the line with whatever strength remained in their trembling limbs. These fleeting acts reminded Richter of one truth. Even in the abyss of D-Day, courage persisted, not grandiose or heroic in legend, but raw, instinctive, and unyielding. As the sun sank lower, the battlefield's chaos shifted subtly, but unmistakably. The Allies had gained ground. Their coordination and numbers were overwhelming. German defenses had slowed them, but the tide of men, tanks, and machines was inexorable. Richter realized that survival, and any hope of inflicting real damage would now depend not on offense but on skillful delay, on exploiting terrain, and on preserving the lives of his remaining men. Every decision became a delicate negotiation with inevitability. Night was approaching, bringing with it a thin veil over the horror, but no true reprieve. Smoke hung low, mingling with the mist from the sea, creating a surreal landscape where life and death blurred. Richter's orders continued, each word deliberate, each motion precise. The bunker had become a crucible where fear and discipline intertwined, a place where courage and survival were inseparable. And through it all, Hauptmann Klaus Richter understood the truth. The battle would not end today nor tomorrow. But inside these walls, for as long as he could stand, he would fight. Night fell over Normandy like a heavy, suffocating blanket, transforming the battlefield into a surreal, shadowed landscape. The roar of artillery and gunfire had subsided only slightly, replaced by intermittent cracks, distant explosions, and the eerie lapping of waves against a shore littered with wreckage. Hauptmann Klaus Richter moved through the bunker corridors, the dim glow of lanterns casting long, flickering shadows across the concrete walls. The air was thick with smoke, the metallic tang of blood, and the damp chill of the North Sea creeping in through narrow cracks. Exhaustion weighed on every man inside, yet none allowed themselves to collapse completely. Fear and duty had fused into a tense, unbreakable discipline. Richter lit a small lamp near the command table and traced the maps with a trembling hand, marking positions, casualties, and depleted supplies. The faces of his men haunted him, Schmidt's, still pale and trembling after hours of machine gun fire, Meyer, grim-faced, blackened by smoke and sweat, dragging wounded comrades from the open. Sand and Müller, whose jaw was tight with fatigue, but whose eyes betrayed a flicker of hope amid terror. Every figure represented a story, a life caught in the grinding machinery of war. Richter's mind oscillated between tactical calculations and human cost, a duality that weighed heavier with each passing hour. The bunker had become a temporary sanctuary against the chaos outside. Within its walls, Richter could still command, still make decisions that might keep some men alive for a few more hours. But beyond the sandbags and steel, the world had changed irrevocably. Smoke hung over the dunes like a shroud. The wreckage of tanks and landing craft littered the surf, and the cries of the dying punctuated the night. He could see flashes of flame on the horizon, shells landing on what remained of German fortification. The tide of battle had shifted, yet even in this moment, Richter's discipline held firm. He walked among the men, inspecting positions and offering terse words of encouragement. "Hold fast. Stay alert. Do your duty," he repeated, though the phrases had become hollow echoes in a day filled with suffering. Private Weber shivered violently, and Richter placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've survived this long. You can survive longer. Focus." The young soldier nodded, eyes wide, as though anchoring himself to Richter's presence in a world gone mad. Every interaction was a delicate balance between discipline and empathy, a tightrope walk where any misstep could spell death. For a moment, Richter allowed himself reflection. He thought of his family, of letters he would never send, of a home that now felt impossibly distant. He thought of the soldiers he had trained, argued with, and depended upon. Many lay wounded or dead, their fates sealed by the relentless machinery of the Allied invasion. Richter understood, in the quiet of the night, that war was not about glory but survival. And survival came at a cost so high that even victory would never fully redeem it. He opened a small journal, its pages smudged with dust and soot, and began to record the events of the day. The act of writing brought a sliver of control, a semblance of order in a universe consumed by chaos. Every shell trajectory, every casualty, every tactical movement was catalogued with meticulous care. Richter understood that memory would be the only thing left to honor those who had fought and died, the only thing capable of preserving the truth of what had happened. Each word was a small defiance against the obliteration surrounding them. The night was punctuated by sporadic shelling, each explosion sending tremors through the bunker. Richter ducked instinctively, counting seconds, noting the direction of impact. He observed his men, their faces illuminated briefly by flashes of fire outside. Fatigue had carved deep lines into their features, fear had sharpened their instincts. Yet, despite everything, they persisted. Discipline had become their armor, and courage their lifeline. Richter recognized that survival was not merely physical, it was a matter of will, a test of mental and emotional fortitude in the crucible of endless violence. Amid the darkness, he witnessed small, poignant acts of humanity. Maya, still coated in soot, applied first aid to a wounded comrade, murmuring words of encouragement that barely rose above the ambient noise. Richter allowed himself a grim acknowledgement of the significance. Even in war, even amid carnage, compassion endured not grandly or heroically, but quietly, stubbornly, like a candle refusing to be snuffed by wind. These acts of humanity gave him a fragile sense of hope that life in some form would continue beyond the horror. Hours passed, yet Richter's vigilance never wavered. He returned to the observation slit, peering into the darkness, trying to track movement along the distant beach. Smoke obscured most of the battlefield, but the occasional flash revealed soldiers moving, equipment abandoned, flames licking the horizon. He calculated trajectories for anticipated artillery fire, adjusted defensive positions, and prepared for the inevitable resumption of full-scale assault at dawn. Every decision was made with a cold logic sharpened by exhaustion and fear. Each moment of inaction could be fatal. The night's stillness was deceptive. Richter knew it was merely a lull in the storm, a fragile pause before the relentless tide returned. Outside, the ocean whispered and roared simultaneously, indifferent to the destruction along its shore. The tide had brought men, machines, and fire, and it would bring more. Richter understood that their endurance, their discipline, and their ability to adapt were the only weapons they truly possessed. And though he carried the weight of command, he also carried the fleeting, invaluable moments of shared humanity that had sustained them through the day. As the hours wore on, Richter finally allowed himself a deep breath, one that carried both exhaustion and a fleeting clarity. The men in his command had survived, at least for now. The bunker, though battered, still held, and though the battle for Normandy raged on, Richter understood that this night, this pause was a moment of reflection, a chance to reconcile strategy with morality, duty with human cost. He would remember each face, each act of courage and desperation, and he would carry these memories long after the roar of guns faded into history. The night pressed on, thick with fog and silence, yet alive with the echoes of the day. Richter settled near the lamp, journal open, recording observations, thoughts, and the stark truth of D-Day from within the concrete walls of Battery WN62. He knew that dawn would bring another wave, another challenge, another test of courage and survival. But in this moment, amid flickering shadows and whispered prayers, Hauptmann Klaus, Richter allowed himself to simply exist, to bear witness, to remember, and to survive. The first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, filtering through smoke and fog to cast the beach in a sickly, grey glow. Hauptmann Klaus Richter had not slept, his body stiff with exhaustion, his mind locked in a relentless calculus of survival and command. The night had been a brief reprieve, a fragile pause in the relentless tide of chaos, but now, with the rising sun, the horror resumed with renewed ferocity. The Allies had regrouped, and their advance was methodical, terrifyingly precise. The dunes shimmered with the movement of men, tanks, and artillery, every wave a calculated push toward the German fortifications. Richter moved through the bunker like a shadow, his eyes scanning the maps, charts, and sandbag positions with unerring precision. The radio crackled intermittently with reports from scattered outposts, messages fractured by static, panic, and urgency. Some positions had fallen, others were barely holding. Reinforcements were delayed, misrouted, or immobilized by the overwhelming scale of the assault. Richter's chest tightened with the weight of responsibility. Every second lost could cost lives. Every miscalculation could mean the annihilation of his battery and the men under his command. Through the observation slit, Richter's gaze fell upon the first landing craft of the morning assault. Smoke and fire from previous strikes had barely cleared, yet more troops were pressing forward, wading through icy surf, crawling over sandbags, and charging the dunes. Their determination was frightening. Even as shells and bullets tore through ranks, they advanced unrelenting. Richter barked orders, redirecting his remaining guns to the most immediate threats, adjusting firing angles, and coordinating with flak units overhead. Every decision was a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The bunker shook as a nearby explosion sent dust and fragments cascading from the ceiling. Private Schmidt stumbled, coughing violently, and Richter grabbed him by the collar. "Focus, keep your position. This is your moment." The young soldier nodded, jaw tight, gripping the weapon with renewed determination. Around them, other men scrambled to maintain positions, load guns, and aim mortars. Each breath, each movement, was weighed down by fear and adrenaline. The line between courage and desperation had blurred. Richter watched as the first tanks reached the dunes, their treads grinding sand and shattered obstacles with a terrifying inevitability. Artillery shells slammed into the soft earth nearby, throwing clouds of smoke and sand into the air. The cries of wounded men, German and Allied alike, echoed across the battlefield. For a brief moment, Richter allowed himself to see the sheer scale of the human cost. Then he shoved the thought aside. There was no time for mourning. Survival demanded focus, discipline, and action. He barked orders to the machine gun crews: cover the eastern approach. Mortars, fire at the second wave. Adjust. Adjust. The sound of weapons roared, an unrelenting barrage that tried to stem the tide of soldiers pouring onto the beach. Each target struck was a small victory, a brief defiance against the inexorable force advancing across the sand. Yet Richter knew it could not last. Every moment of resistance came at a cost. Ammunition was dwindling, men were fatigued, and the physical and psychological toll was mounting. From the observation slit, Richter spotted a squad of Allied soldiers maneuvering through a gap between fortifications. Their movements were precise, trained, and terrifyingly calm. He calculated firing angles, coordinated with his gunners, and unleashed a barrage of shells and bullets. Some fell, some pressed forward regardless. The chaos of war, Richter realized, could not be fully controlled. Survival depended on anticipation, rapid adaptation, and the grim acceptance of inevitability. The tide of men and machines seemed endless. Every shell that struck the beach was replaced by another. Every fallen soldier seemed to be joined by two more. Richter felt the first waves of hopelessness creeping in, gnawing at the edges of his discipline. Yet even amid the despair, his mind remained razor-sharp, cataloging losses, adjusting fire, and maintaining the fragile structure of command. He could not allow fear to dictate action, not today, not now. The men depended on him, and he would not fail them. A tank shell landed closer than Richter had anticipated, shaking the bunker violently. Dust and splinters filled the air, and a nearby wall cracked. Richter ducked instinctively, feeling the bunker groan under the impact. "Hold. Maintain position," he shouted, voice hoarse but unwavering. Private Weber, covered in soot and sweat, adjusted the machine gun with trembling hands but managed to keep firing. Courage, Richter realized again, was not grandiose. It was persistence. It was the act of surviving another moment, of doing one's duty despite fear, exhaustion, and the inevitability of death. The morning pressed on, turning hours into an endless trial of endurance. Smoke and flame mingled with the mist, blurring lines between land, sea, and sky. Men moved like shadows across the dunes, some charging, some crawling, all relentless. Richter coordinated artillery and flak, reallocating resources with meticulous precision, while mentally noting each casualty, each expenditure, each critical point of defense. The bunker had become a command center, a refuge, a crucible where human resolve was tested against overwhelming odds. By mid-morning, Richter allowed himself a fleeting moment to observe the broader picture. The Allies were consolidating gains, advancing across the beach, and threatening to overrun the dunes entirely. Resistance had slowed them, inflicted casualties, and delayed the inevitable, but momentum was unmistakable. Richter's mind raced. Reposition the mortars, reinforce the flanks, save shells for the tanks. Every choice was a balance between tactical advantage and the preservation of his men. Amid the chaos, human resilience persisted. Corporal Meyer dragged a wounded comrade to cover, Private Schmitz found a rhythm in loading the machine gun, and Müller coordinated suppressive fire with grim precision. Small victories, fleeting acts of courage, formed the backbone of survival. Richter clung to these moments, understanding that they were the thin threads keeping the fabric of defense intact. As the morning wore on, the tide of battle surged ever forward. Richter's mind, body, and spirit were stretched to their limits, yet he remained a pillar of discipline in the maelstrom. Every second survived, every command executed, was both defiance and necessity. The Allies were advancing, the cost of resistance mounting, and the outcome uncertain. And in this crucible of fire, sand, and smoke, Hauptmann Klaus Richter understood the ultimate truth of D-Day. Survival demanded courage, clarity, and unyielding resolve, even when the world outside the bunker seemed determined to tear itself apart. By midday, the world outside Battery W62 had become unrecognizable. The beach was a scarred wasteland of sand, smoke, fire, and twisted metal. The relentless tide of Allied soldiers pressed forward with mechanical precision, their numbers overwhelming even the most disciplined defenses. Hauptmann Klaus Richter stood in the bunker, a figure of grim determination against the chaos. His hands were blackened with gunpowder and sweat, his uniform streaked with soot and blood, yet his mind remained razor-sharp. Every command, every calculation, every decision had been a battle for survival. Not victory, but even that tenuous control was slipping away. Through the observation slit, Richter could see the final breaches forming. Dunes that had been defended with rifles, machine guns, and artillery were now being clawed at by men and tanks, relentless in their advance. Shells and bullets cut swaths of death through both defenders and invaders alike. Yet the sheer volume of enemy forces was undeniable. Richter's men, exhausted beyond measure, fought with the last vestiges of strength, dragging themselves toward their posts, loading mortars, and firing until their arms ached and their vision blurred. He could hear the faint, frantic cries of the wounded, punctuated by the unmistakable thrum of artillery from the naval bombardment offshore. He moved swiftly through the bunker, issuing final orders with the precision of a man who had no choice but to act. Shift the left flank. Mortars, focus fire on the dunes. Cover the retreat. Each command was both a defiance against fate and a measure to preserve as many lives as possible. Private Schmitz, his face pale and smeared with dirt, worked the machine gun with trembling hands. Richter clapped a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're doing fine, son. Keep fighting. Every second counts." Schmitz nodded, jaw tight, eyes wide but focused. Despite the exhaustion and despair, Richter noticed small glimmers of humanity. Meyer, bloodied but resolute, dragged a severely wounded soldier behind a sandbag wall, murmuring encouragement through gritted teeth. Müller coordinated suppressive fire with grim determination, ensuring that even the most desperate actions had an effect. These acts of courage and compassion, fleeting though they were, gave Richter a fragile thread of hope that not all was lost. Even in collapse, human will persisted. The bunker shook violently as a shell landed dangerously close, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. Richter ducked instinctively, shouting, "Hold positions. Fire at will. Do not let them take the guns." The men obeyed, their discipline a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Shells hit with unrelenting force, but the defenders, precise aim, managed to slow the enemy, advanced though only barely, Each successful strike was temporary, a fleeting reprieve in a battle that seemed fated to overwhelm them. Richter's mind raced with calculations. Supplies were nearly exhausted. Ammunition dwindled with every salvo. Reinforcements were nowhere to be found. The tide of the battle was inexorable. He knew, with chilling clarity, that the battery could not hold forever. Every second of resistance was a victory, but it was also a countdown. The inevitability of defeat loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, yet he could not allow despair to govern his actions. His men depended on him, and he would fight until the last moment. Through the smoke, Richter watched as the enemy breached the final line of sandbags. Tanks rumbled forward, their treads crushing earth and debris, relentless and unstoppable. Infantry surged behind them, climbing over obstacles and suppressing the remaining defenses. Richter barked one last series of commands, repositioning the remaining mortars, directing the machine gun crews and calculating trajectories for every remaining shell. Time had contracted. Every heartbeat was amplified, every decision weighted with mortal consequence. Then, in a brief, haunting silence between waves of gunfire, Richter allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the men he had commanded, the young soldiers whose lives had been consumed by fear, courage, and duty. He thought of the families they would never see again, the letters they would never write, the lives interrupted by an unstoppable tide of history. He thought of the battlefield itself, a scar across Normandy that would never fully heal. And in that brief pause, Richter understood the full cost of war, not as strategy, not as victory or defeat, but as human lives, fragile and irreplaceable, caught in the machinery of history. The final moments were a blur of noise and motion. Shells tore into sand and concrete, smoke curled around every position, and men moved with desperate determination. Richter's orders continued, a mix of strategy, instinct, and defiance. Each command was an attempt to assert control over a world gone mad. And then, with a final crushing surge, the enemy breached the bunker perimeter. Richter's men fought to the last round, their courage unwavering even as the walls collapsed around them. As the Allied soldiers entered, Richter finally lowered his weapon, exhaustion and resignation mingling in his chest. His eyes swept over the battlefield one last time, the ruined dunes, the smoking wrecks, the struggling survivors. In that moment, he understood that survival was not always victory, that courage could exist even in defeat, and that the human spirit could endure even amidst unimaginable destruction. Hauptmann Klaus Richter had held the line, preserved discipline and order, and borne witness to history from within the walls of Battery WN62. Even as the bunker fell, Richter allowed himself a final thought, that the stories, the acts of bravery, the lives lost and endured would not be forgotten. He had survived in memory, in record, in witness, and in that preservation, in the testament of what had been endured, the legacy of D-Day from a German officer's view would persist long after the echoes of gunfire had faded across Normandy.